The wind swept through the canyon like a forgotten song, lifting fine dust from the cracked earth. The sky that day was blood red, the color of dried-out soil of time, decayed. Will Carver rode slow through the rockfall boots caked in red mud, one hand on the reins, the other resting lightly on the worn stock of his old Winchester, aged like his own life. He wasn't looking for anything. No one came to this wasteland searching for something. But fate doesn't need you to look, it finds you. He saw them at a bend in the rock where dry mesquite cast thin shadows. At first he thought it was some animal that had died of thirst curled up by a stone. But then, the small shape moved, just barely like a breath about to fade. Will dismounted his boot heels scraping on loose gravel. As he stepped closer, the scene came into focus like a fresh wound. A woman lying, still face, sunken lips, gray arms wrapped tight around the frail body of a girl, no older than 14. The girl's eyes were open, dark hollow, parched but alive. She didn't cry, didn't speak, just stared. "Hey," Will called out, voice rough as sand. The girl blinked as if every motion hurt. "Can you move?" he asked. Her lips moved. No sound. Then just barely a whisper, like wind slipping through stone maw. "Won't wake up." Will bowed his head. The woman had been dead at least 2 days. Fever and exhaustion had taken her. Her tangled hair clung to her temples, hand still clutching the girl's shirt like she'd died mid-dream. Will stood there, hand on his hip, eyes cast toward some nameless point in the horizon. He could have walked away, could have mounted up and told the sheriff in town. She wasn't his blood, wasn't his responsibility. Folks would understand. But when he looked again, that girl Elsie didn't beg, didn't weep, just stared at him with eyes far older than her years, like she'd already seen the end of the world. And suddenly, Will wasn't in that canyon anymore. He was back in that dirt shack from long ago where his little sister Clara died of smallpox. So small, the blanket barely covered her. His mother had faded with each breath, and his father walked away with dry footsteps that never returned. In that moment, something long buried cracked open inside him, tearing through the calluses he'd built over a lifetime. Will knelt down, pulled a folding shovel from his saddlebag and started to dig. The ground was dry and hard, but he didn't stop. Nearly an hour passed before he wrapped the mother's body in an old shawl and laid her to rest with all the dignity a godless place like this could allow. He folded her arms, closed his eyes, not with prayer, but with the silence of a man who had once abandoned even his own soul. Then he stood, turned to the girl. "Let's go." She didn't move, not asking again. Will bent down, lifted her as if cradling a breath. She was weightless, skin bone, and something burning quietly in her chest. In her hand she held a ragged cloth doll with no face worn down to the last thread. He set her behind him on the horse, then rode out of the canyon with slow, deliberate steps, carrying not just a girl, but memories he thought were long dead. She didn't speak the entire way, but her small hand gripped the back of his coat, silent, steady. And Will Carver, the man who'd never meant to save anyone, said nothing either. But in that silence something began to shift. No vow, no name for the bond just born. Only wind dust and 2 souls left standing after loss, riding on together without ever looking back. Winter came slow but certain, like an unyielding hand pulling a white icy blanket over the canyon and valley, where Will Carver had brought young Elsie to camp near the creek. The little tent pitched beside his cabin, and made from oilcloth old planks and a worn tarp he'd found in the shed, wasn't much, but it held its ground in the wind. Every time Will saw the faint wisp of smoke rise from the rusty stovepipe he'd spent a whole week patching up, he felt a little steadier inside, though something unnamed still echoed hollow in his chest. Elsie didn't cry that first night, didn't ask questions. She just curled up beneath 3 layers of blankets, eyes wide open, like she was afraid that if she blinked, the whole fragile refuge would vanish. Will didn't say much either, partly because he'd never been good with words, and partly because he was navigating a strange new country inside himself. For the first time, someone was close enough to see him every day, with all his rough edges and bruises. By day, the girl moved like a shadow, quiet, light-footed, but always there. Each morning, Will chopped wood-brewed coffee, worked the cattle shed. And when he came back, sometimes his cup had already been washed and placed neatly by the wash basin. In the tool shed, the hammer and rope had been hung back exactly where they belonged, tidier than he ever managed. No thanks, no explanation, just small steady signs. And at night, when the wind outside howled like an old wolf searching for its memories, Will heard the scratch of a pencil. At some point, Elsie had found an old leather notebook in a chest, along with a worn-down pencil. Every evening, the oil lamp in her tent cast flickering shadows against the walls as she wrote. Will never asked what she was putting down, never peeked, but sometimes in the long silences that stretched like centuries, he wondered if he was in those pages. Days passed, the way winter always moves, slow, merciless quiet. Each morning, snow covered the roof of the cabin like it meant to erase every trace of life. Will taught her how to start a fire with dry kindling, how to split logs without glancing the axe, how to brew coffee without burning the pot. She learned fast, never needed things repeated, and slowly Will realized this girl wasn't just around. She was present, not through words, but through the way everything around him started to feel a little less cluttered, a little easier to breathe. As if she was saying, in her own way, "I'm staying." One evening, the snow fell thick as feathers, so heavy Will had to rope the cabin door shut. He'd just ladled out a bowl of hot stew when he heard a soft cough from the little tent. He jumped up, rushed over, and found her shivering hard forehead slick with sweat, eyes closed in a fever. Without thinking, he carried her into the cabin, laid her on his own bed, wrapped her in heavy blankets, boiled water pressed warm cloths to her brow. All night he stayed by her side, muttering words even he couldn't remember later. But he kept speaking like he was praying for something to hold on, something more than just her small body. When the fever finally broke, she said nothing, just glanced at him once before slipping back into sleep. And Will, sitting on the edge of the bed, arms resting on his knees, felt something soften inside, like part of him had thawed, no longer frozen stiff like the ground outside. A week later, when the weather warmed slightly, she moved back into her little tent. He didn't ask her to stay. She didn't ask for permission. But that night, beneath the tin cup set neatly on her nightstand, there was a rough scrap of paper. "Not cold at night anymore. Stay here. W." From that moment on, they weren't just two strangers living near each other. They were two old wounds learning quietly, slowly how to heal. Together, in the same rhythm of breath. Time never warns you when it begins to change someone, especially a girl growing up between wind and campfire. Elsie was no longer the frail child Will Carver had once carried from the edge of that winter canyon. Quiet springs had come and gone, taking with them the softness in her face and leaving behind something solemn, measured as if time had carved maturity into every strand of her hair, every glance of her eyes. Will never counted days, but he began noticing changes in the smallest things. In the mornings when he opened the door, coffee was already on the table, steam fogging up the window panes. Some days, when he got to the cattle shed, the feed trays had already been refilled. The worn shirts he left draped over chairs came back folded, the collars stitched neatly with matching thread. He didn't ask, and she didn't tell. But every time he saw something done for him, he gave a small nod, like a nod to the wind. Elsie no longer slept in the little tent outside. One winter, Will quietly built a new room off the main cabin wooden floors, a proper bed. He never explained, just said old place is too damp. Not good. She didn't thank him, just wiped down the dust with an old rag and placed her leather journal on the nightstand. By day she still didn't talk much, but her steps were steady. She learned how to mix cornmeal without lumps, how to slice apples evenly, how to stack wood so it dried right. She wore shirts patched together from Will's old clothes, and slowly they fit her growing frame. Once he saw his old work shirt, the collar fixed buttons replaced with smooth shells. The next morning he wore it to the horse shed without saying a word. But when he came back, she was standing in the doorway, one hand gripping the wooden frame cheeks just a shade pinker than usual. At night, while he buried himself in fixing a wagon wheel or cleaning his rifle, Elsie sat nearby, her hand gliding gently over the pages of her journal, as if guarding each word she wrote. Will never asked what was inside, but sometimes when she closed the book and their eyes met just a beat longer than a breath, he knew he lived in those pages now. She didn't look at him like a father, and Will, despite himself, could no longer see her as the child she once was. He began to notice the look in her eyes when he returned from the woods, a kind of quiet relief. He felt her hand linger a bit too long when she touched a scratch on his arm. And on hot afternoons when he worked shirtless under the sun, he knew there were eyes watching him through the kitchen curtain, swaying gently in the breeze. Will kept his distance, not because he didn't see it, but because he saw it too clearly. He feared it, feared what the world might call such feelings, feared his own heart locked away since Clara's death, now trembling for the first time in years. Then one day, a horse bucked him, threw him so hard his chest seized and his head cracked against stone. When he came to, she was bent over him, hands trembling as she wiped the blood from his forehead, eyes glossy with tears. He grabbed her hand on instinct, no thought, and she didn't pull away. She only whispered, "You're not allowed to die." After that, they returned to silence. But something between them had shifted. Elsie kept writing in her journal, but now she wasn't writing to hide anything she wrote because she had to. The words were no longer shaky, but strong, like roots gripping the earth. "You're the only dream I ever dared to keep. You don't see me. Or maybe you see me too clearly, and that's why you turn away." And in every line, a young woman was learning to love, not with fantasy, but with the knowing of someone who had sat beside a wound and stayed. That afternoon the air was heavy with the scent of rain. The wind shifted a signal too subtle for most, but not for those who'd lived long enough out in nature to know when something was about to break. Elsie had gone down the valley to gather kindling, her hair braided neatly, humming a vague tune under her breath. Will stayed behind, planning only to sweep out the old tent brush, the dust off the bed, fix a squeaky hinge that had been groaning for weeks. As he lifted the straw mattress to check the floorboards, something small slipped out a weathered brown leather notebook. He recognized it instantly. Elsie's journal, the one she wrote in each night under the flickering oil lamp. His hand moved to put it back, but something instinct curiosity, maybe a nameless fear, made his fingers flip open the first page. And everything changed. His name was there right from the first line, not in the tone of a grateful child, but in something deeper, raw emotion, so real it made Will feel like he'd been punched in the chest. Each word was a confession never spoken aloud. Love-longing, the quiet ache of a girl who had grown up in silence, but never stopped seeing him as her entire world. "You weren't just the one who saved me. You were the first person who made me want to stay. If I kissed you, would you turn away? If I left, would you come after me?" Will sank into the chair, heart pounding, like he'd just ridden a hard mile without stopping. He wasn't angry at her. He was angry at himself for letting it grow, for seeing the way she looked at him, for feeling it all, and pretending it wasn't there. Like silence could erase the truth from a person's soul. The door creaked open just as the wind screamed across the porch. Elsie stepped inside and froze when she saw him. The journal laid out on the table, his face still and storm-dark. "Where'd you hide this?" he asked, voice low and dry as stone. She knew. Her eyes flicked to the notebook, then to him. She didn't speak at first. Then, as if pushed off a ledge, she rushed forward and snatched it off the table, clutching it to her chest like an open wound. "You had no right to read that," she whispered, her voice shaking. "That part was mine. It wasn't for you." Will opened his mouth, tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He stood not moving toward her, not backing away, just standing still, locked in a battle inside himself. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said, tears now spilling freely. "I didn't mean for you to know. I know it's wrong. I just can't stop loving you." And before he could say anything, she turned and ran. No coat, no boots, just a blur of loose hair and bare feet, pounding against the cold ground, swallowed by the howling wind and trees. Will stood frozen, like the sky had collapsed around him. A minute passed, then another. And then the fear hit him, not the kind born of guilt or judgment, but a deeper, sharper fear. The kind you feel when you're about to lose the one thing that brought warmth back into your life. He grabbed his coat, his rifle, and ran into the storm, calling her name into the wind. Elsie, Elsie. The sky split open with thunder. Rain fell in sheets, hard and wild. Will crashed through the thinning woods, boots sinking into the soaked earth, eyes scanning every shadow. He called again and again, voice raw, throat burning. In his mind, his mother's dying words echoed like a curse. Don't let your sister die alone, the way I let you. Not again. Not this time. Branches lashed at his face, wind flung cold water into his eyes, blood mixed with rain. But he didn't stop. Then he saw a faint flicker of oil light trembling between narrow rocks. He slid down the slope, boots churning in the mud, and stopped dead. Elsie was curled beside a fallen tree. The lamp already out, her hair soaked and plastered to her face. Her eyes were unfocused. And creeping toward her was a wolf, skinny, desperate, drawn by the scent of weakness. Will didn't hesitate. One shot cracked through the storm, splitting the air like a cry ripped from the earth. The wolf fled, and in the echo left behind, she looked up at him, eyes wide, breaking. He rushed to her, swept her into his arms. She sobbed against his chest. I'm sorry. I didn't know how to stop loving you. Will held her tightly, pressed his forehead to hers. I'm not angry because you love me, he whispered. I'm angry because I love you too, and I've spent every day trying to forget that. As the rain softened around them, and their arms clung tight like they'd vanish if they let go, they finally understood love, no matter how hidden, how denied, will always find its way back. The rain poured down like the sky itself was trying to wash away everything people were too afraid to face. In Will's arms, Elsie trembled, lips, pale eyes wide, as if she couldn't quite believe he was really there. She clung to his coat fingers, cold and curled tight, but her heart was pounding not from fear, but from the weight that had just been lifted from her chest after all those silent, buried years. I'm sorry, she breathed through the rain, her voice barely more than a breath. I didn't mean to run. I can't stop loving you. Will held her tighter, like he was afraid she'd slip away again, like that confession could collapse every wall between them, and he wasn't ready for the fall. But he was still there. His head-bowed forehead pressed to hers, their breath mingling in the cold, like an ember refusing to die out. I'm not angry that you love me, Will whispered, voice rough and ancient, like a stone that's lived 1,000 winters. I'm angry because I love you too. And I've been trying to forget that. Every damn day. Elsie looked up at him, eyes brimming not with fear this time, but with something searching. She was looking for a crack in the stone wall she thought she'd never get through. And now, she saw it. A fracture. A place where light had started to seep in. Will took a slow step back, not away from her, but to see her fully. For the first time, he looked at her. Not as the girl he'd rescued, not as a memory he'd kept at arm's length, but as the woman, the only one who had seen the part of him he was too afraid to face in the mirror. I've loved you for a long time, he said. Since those mornings you'd get up before me and make coffee without a word. Since you stitched my shirt collar with shell buttons like it was nothing. Since the way you turned this worn-down cabin into a home. And I buried it all. Because I was scared. Scared of what she whispered. Scared I'd break you. Scared people would see you as some kid who loved wrong. Scared that my love would be more of a scar than a healing. She lifted her hand shaking and gently touched his cheek where blood from a storm-scratched cut had dried. I'm not a kid anymore, Will. I know what I'm choosing. And I choose you. The wind began to settle. The rain softened to a hush on their shoulders, their hair. They stood there in the quiet woods, the storm passing around them like the whole world was holding its breath for two souls who'd finally found each other. No music, no fireworks, just the rhythm of a heartbeat. Will leaned in, not rushing. He looked at her one more time, asking without words. And when she closed her eyes softly, like opening a door to a new season, he kissed her. Their first kiss wasn't like the stories people tell, not wild, not burning. It was a promise that after all the silence, all the scars, all the unspoken things, they had found their way back. His arms wrapped around her shoulders. Her hands trembled against his back, holding tight to a dream she once feared would vanish. The scent of wet earth, of sweat of fire burning somewhere in the distance, all of it wove together in that moment, into something more sacred than a love confession recognition. When they finally pulled apart, she whispered like a prayer she didn't want to shatter the moment. So, what happens now? Will looked at her. His eyes no longer flinched away. Now, he said, we stop running. And we start again, not in a journal, not in silence, but with this. He touched her chest where her heart still beat fast and real beneath his hand. Elsie smiled, a small trembling smile, but brighter than any sunrise she'd ever seen. Above them the clouds began to part, revealing the first light of morning. The wind carried the scent of new grass, just beginning to grow. And in the world just after the storm had spent all its fury, they found a small corner where they could begin again together. Since that night, they never spoke of love again, but everything had changed. Not through declarations, but through quiet, steady things. They never walked into a church, never signed a paper, never said vows aloud. But each morning, when Will poured 2 cups of coffee, and Elsie placed a neatly folded napkin beside his cup, that was a promise repeated each day that said, I'm here. I choose to stay. Spring arrived like the land had never known gentleness before. The snow melted slow, giving way to wildflowers peeking through stone. Will and Elsie began to rebuild the cabin, one board, one shingle at a time. Not because they had to, because they wanted to make something with their own hands for each other. The work was far from perfect, some cuts too short, some nails crooked, but by season's end, a small cabin stood by the creek. Not tall, not flawless, but warm, and enough. Will rebuilt the back door, lowering the hinge so it'd fit her reach. She resewed the curtains from old cloth scraps she found in a trunk. One afternoon he found his name written in chalk on the side of the barn Will, and just beneath it in softer, gentler handwriting, Elsie. No last names, no titles, just 2 names side by side in the sun and wind. They didn't say, I love you every day. Instead, Will held her hand when she cut her finger wrapping it with a piece of his old shirt. Elsie saved the last piece of cornbread for him, always placed warm water by the bed when he got home late. On quiet afternoons, they sat on the porch, Will whittling spoons, Elsie reading her legs draped over his knee. No words, none needed. A year later, when orphaned children from nearby shelters started arriving, Elsie suggested turning the cabin into a schoolhouse during the day. Will didn't ask why. He just nodded, built shelves, swept the floor, cleared out the stove. Each morning, the children came alone without family, without a place to call home, just as she once had. Elsie taught them to read, write, add, and subtract, and told stories with a voice Will often paused to listen to from outside the door. Inside that classroom, love didn't show itself through roses or rings, but in the way she wiped the chalkboard clean, the way he carved each child's name into their lunchbox, and how they sat together every night by the fire, reading pages from an old book with worn, smudged corners. Once someone asked Will why he never married her, why there were no papers tying them together. Will just smiled, his sun-worn hand brushing a dried ink mark on his shirt. You ever hear the way she says my name? He asked. Or how she always saves me the tip of the roast? Or how I always know she likes her tea, thick, not weak. No piece of paper ever taught me that. Only love. And time. Elsie never heard those words, but she understood. Because that night when she walked into the kitchen and saw he had folded the tablecloth, something she usually did, she knew he had answered her, in the language they both spoke. There was no ring, but she wore a thin leather cord around her neck, and inside it was the first button she ever sewed onto his shirt, now smooth-worn, shiny by time and quiet patience. And in the evenings, when the oil lamp went dark and the creek whispered its endless lullaby beyond the window, they lay side by side, breath-touching breath heartbeats folding into the rhythm of the wind. And in that silence, there were no vows, no titles, only two people who had once broken and now were choosing each day to rebuild each other with small, unspoken grace. The house they built was made of wood and faith, not law, but love. And in their world there was no need to say forever, because every day they lived like it had already begun. There was something strange about that afternoon. The sun was half covered by clouds, like a scar across a once bright forehead, and red dust rose in thick spirals from the end of the dirt road, a warning if you knew how to read it. Will was mending the back fence near the cattle shed when he looked up and saw 3 riders approaching the cabin, stiff in posture, their hat brims casting long shadows across their saddles. Leading them was old Danvers, a court officer from the town beyond the ridge. Will recognized him even from a distance. The 2 behind him wore deputy uniforms, crisp and clean, but their eyes held nothing but judgment. They dismounted slowly without so much as a polite nod, carrying the weight of the law as if they meant to lay it heavy across the land. Will and Elsie had built with their own hands. Will Carver Danvers' asked voice flat and cold, like cooled iron. "That's me," Will said, standing upright, one hand resting on the fence rail like it was the only thing keeping his mind steady. "We've been told you're living with a young woman. Not your wife, not kin, and no legal documents to say otherwise. Is that true?" Will didn't answer right away. He glanced toward the porch where Elsie stood holding a basket of freshly picked apples, her face frozen at the sight of strangers. She moved like she might retreat inside, but Will's gaze held her, not with a gesture, but with a stillness solid as the beams of the cabin behind him. "Her name's Elsie," Will said slowly. "She lives here, yes, but she's not mine by any paper. There's been no wedding, no preacher to bless us. Just this." He paused, voice lowering. "We love each other, and that doesn't need carving into stone to be real." One of the deputies scoffed. "Love without law, without marriage, she's nothing. Just a nameless girl. No land, no rights. You keeping her here, it's not much different from." Will cut in. Not loud, but every word carved like a blade. "She doesn't need paper to exist. She exists in the way I pour her tea each morning, in every stitch she's sewn into my shirt, in the little schoolhouse she built for kids no one else cared to remember. She is more present in this world than any birth certificate you're holding in that satchel." Danvers' voice turned sharp. "We're not here to argue the philosophy of love, Carver. We're here to remind you society has standards. People are whispering. A man living with a young woman who isn't his wife with no legal ties, they call that indecent." Will gripped the rail tighter, but his eyes didn't flinch. "Then let them talk. I was once a boy no one stood up for. I watched my sister die slow because no one came in time. I swore that if I ever loved someone, I wouldn't let the world claw at them with its teeth of judgment. If that makes me wrong in the eyes of the law, then fine. But I will never apologize for choosing to love." The silence between them stretched taut like a bowstring ready to snap. Then Danvers exhaled, gave a short nod. Not agreement, but the kind of recognition that said he knew no badge in the world could move Will Carver from where he stood. "All right," Danvers muttered. "Keep her, but don't bring her into town. Don't register a school. Keep it quiet." Will didn't reply. He just watched Danvers like a gust of wind passing over the porch roof, loud, noticeable, but not strong enough to uproot what had been planted by hand and heart. When they were gone, Will turned back. Elsie still stood on the steps, eyes glistening, both hands gripping the basket tight. He walked over gently, eased it from her grasp, then took her hands in both of his. "They want proof you belong here," he said softly. She looked up, lips pressed together as if holding back something ready to break. "And do I?" she asked. Will placed her hand over his chest where his heart beat slow and certain. You belong wherever someone loves you, not for what the law says, but for who you are. She smiled just a little, like a breath finally released after years of being held in. And in that moment, there wasn't a single law or power that could come between them, between a choice made without contracts, without signatures, only the courage of two people willing to believe. After that, no one came knocking on the little cabin's door anymore. The town slowly forgot its whispers. They didn't enroll her in any school, didn't get married, didn't stamp their story with any official seal. Yet day by day, week by week, season by season, Will and Elsie lived together, as if the world had silently agreed. As if their love, though without a marriage certificate, was as clear as the horizon after a storm undeniable. They kept teaching the children no one else wanted. Kids who arrived with empty hands but left with letters and stories full of hope. They still planted carrots, tended cows, mended shirts, washed their hands in the cold creek water, and shared coffee each morning. They still argued over fixing the porch roof when the seasonal winds came, and sometimes all it took was a single glance to say, "Today, I need a hug more than I need an answer." There's a small stone by the creek where Will carved their names with the old survival knife. Will and Elsie, we found each other when the world had nothing left. They often sat there at sunset. No words, just presence. Elsie never asked for a wedding. She didn't need one. To her, the creak of the porch, the sound of a knife hitting the cutting board, and Will's hand brushing her back as he walked past the kitchen that was their wedding ceremony. Will never proposed, but he fixed the porch swing so her feet would touch just right. He still bought a spool of red thread every time he passed through town, just because he knew she liked sewing edges in that color. In the American West, where the earth cracks dry and the wind howls through old unhealed memories, love doesn't always look gentle. It's not something shouted on Main Street or framed in a church photo. Here love lives in the stew simmered tender for someone else, in the glances through a doorway when snow starts falling. Love lives in staying when leaving would have been the easier thing to do. And that's what Will and Elsie did. They stayed. Their story didn't end with a ring or a hymn, but with a quiet morning when Elsie stepped onto the porch, coffee steaming in her hand, and saw Will sitting on the steps with a stray kitten asleep in his lap. He didn't say a word, just shrugged slightly as if to say, "It's got no one. We can make some room." Elsie smiled, set the coffee down, and sat beside him. Some loves don't need to be recognized. They just need to be believed. No one hung their picture in a courthouse. No one wrote their names in the church registry. But the kids they taught to read spoke of Teacher Elsie as the woman whose voice was warmer than the fire. The cattleman called Will the man whose hands hold the earth because he plowed straight lines and buried calves like they were family. They weren't rich, they weren't famous, but they were happy, a quiet kind of happiness, the kind that exists like the creek behind the house, endless unseen, but always there. If you're hearing this now, maybe you carry a piece of Will inside you, the fear of loving at the wrong time, the wrong person, the wrong way. Or maybe you're like Elsie, loving with everything you have, not knowing if that love will ever be returned. This story is for you. Love doesn't need permission. It only needs courage. Here we don't tell perfect love stories. We tell stories of people the world often overlooks, people living on the edges of maps and society. People who built a family with nothing but their two hands and a heart that refused to give up. If you believe some relationships can be sacred without rings, if you've ever loved without knowing if you were allowed to, if you've ever built a home no one else calls, right then, you've lived a story worth telling. And if you want to hear more stories like this, of love, that doesn't need proving, only living, follow us. Because sometimes, a heart finds home, not by being led, but by finding someone who's been waiting.